Why would a queen refuse to sleep beside the man she married? For most of the world, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip symbolized stoic unity. A 73-year marriage. Duty, dignity, and devotion. But what if behind the velvet curtains, that image was little more than a carefully crafted lie? Princess and has always been the no-nonsense royal. Tough, private, loyal. But now, after the Queen's passing, and has said something that shook royal insiders to their core. A cold, cutting statement about her own father. There were things about Papa that were simply revolting. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Revolting? What was she referring to? An ugly habit? A private betrayal? Or something even darker? Because here's the truth. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip did not sleep in the same bed for most of their marriage. And while the palace chalked it up to royal tradition, Anne's recent remarks suggest it was something else entirely, something far more personal, far more disturbing. And the most chilling part? This story was never meant to see the light of day. But now that both of them are gone, the silence has been broken. So what did Princess Anne witness? Why did the Queen recoil from the man she was supposed to adore? And what was locked away for decades, only to be uncovered after her death? What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does a daughter do when she sees her mother shrink away from the man the world calls her rock? Princess Anne wasn't just a child of the monarchy. She was a front-row witness to a royal marriage no one truly understood. Growing up behind palace walls, she saw what cameras couldn't. The forced smiles, the long silences, the doors that never opened unless someone knocked twice. She remembers the way her mother's body would stiffen when Prince Philip entered the room. Not with fear, but with discomfort. And then there were the whispers among staff. Housekeepers murmuring about his smell. A valet who refused to return. And once, late at night, a young and overheard her mother mutter just 3 words as she closed her bedroom door. Not tonight, Philip. The official story was always the same. Separate bedrooms are tradition, they'd say. It's how aristocrats live. But Anne knew better. She saw the disgust. She felt the tension. She watched her mother retreat, more and more, with every passing year. And then there was Malta, a chapter in her parents' marriage that had been painted as romantic, even idyllic. But that's not what Anne found in the Queen's private letters. One phrase stood out, burned into her memory. I cannot bear the smell of him some nights. But what happened in Malta that turned affection into aversion? What did the Queen witness there? That Anne would never forget. Because the answer wasn't just uncomfortable, it was explosive. And it was only the beginning. Why would the most powerful woman in the world choose to sleep alone? For decades, the official narrative was airtight. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip kept separate bedrooms purely out of royal tradition. A matter of aristocratic custom, they said. A logistical decision for a monarch and her consort. But those who lived within the palace walls told a different story, one laced with discomfort, avoidance, and disgust. Staff members at Balmoral, Windsor, and Sandringham all noticed it. 2 rooms, 2 schedules, 2 separate lives. Even in their twilight years, the Queen and Philip never reunited under the same blanket. Not for comfort, not for companionship, not even in sickness. And when asked, Princess Anne offered only a cryptic, biting remark. People romanticize what they don't understand. But what was there not to understand? A royal couple, married for over 7 decades, who lived like strangers when the doors were shut. You have to ask yourself, was it tradition, or was it damage control? Because according to one former aide, the Queen made a quiet request early in her reign. Ensure he stays in his own wing. No public explanation, no confrontation, just quiet, calculated separation. And when questioned later, she said only this: it works for us. But what was it? What unspoken tension forced the crown to maintain the illusion? And what had Philip done to earn such distance? The real reason wasn't just logistical, it was deeply personal. And Anne knew the truth, because she'd seen it with her own eyes. Why would the Queen of England, head of the church, symbol of British unity, refuse to share a bed with her husband? Because not even royalty can sleep beside disgust. From the moment Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne, her marriage to Prince Philip was put under a microscope. They were cast as a perfect match. His strength balanced her reserve. His charisma offset her composure. It was the fairy tale the monarchy needed. But behind closed doors, that narrative fractured quickly. While the media beamed images of royal bliss, palace insiders knew something was off. They noticed the odd choreography at public events. The way they entered rooms together but left separately. The way Philip's wing was always closed off. His staff, his rules, his hours. And most strikingly, the beds. Always two. Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Buckingham. Even on overseas tours, always separate bedrooms. Royal protocol? That's what they claimed. But according to one longtime chambermaid at Sandringham, the real reason had nothing to do with tradition. It had everything to do with avoidance. He stank, she said, not of filth, but of defiance, of rebellion, of something the Queen found unbearable, something and would later describe as a kind of quiet, creeping disgust. But let's rewind. In the 1950s, Elizabeth and Philip were newly crowned, still young, still learning how to navigate their roles. And in the early years, yes, they shared a room. Briefly, but those days were numbered. After a certain trip, one that remains heavily redacted in royal travel logs, their sleeping arrangements changed. Permanently. That trip was to Malta, the honeymoon chapter in every royal biography, the place where they were supposed to be the happiest. But it was also the place where something snapped. Sources close to Princess and say she found a letter, tucked inside one of her mother's personal diaries, hidden behind a painting in a rarely opened private sitting room. The letter was addressed not to Philip, but to the Queen's dresser. In it, Elizabeth described a scene most royal historians have never dared to mention. She wrote, "He came to me smelling of gin and sweat, and that awful lotion he insists on using. I asked him to leave. He didn't. I locked myself in the bathroom and wept. What was in that lotion? Why did the Queen, so composed, so hardened by duty, use a word as visceral as wept? And, reportedly only in her teens when she first read that note, never spoke of it. Not publicly, not even to her brothers. But she watched, and remembered. She noticed how her mother would avoid physical contact in public appearances. How, in private, she would refer to Philip in increasingly clipped terms. Your father. Never Philip. Rarely darling. And then there was the staff rotation. Aides assigned to the Queen would often leave suddenly. Rumors circulated, especially after one footman resigned midweek without notice. I can't stay here. Not after what I heard, he allegedly told a colleague. No explanation. No warning. Just gone. Years later, Princess Diana would describe the atmosphere inside Buckingham as cold. But, and saw something colder, two people pretending to be in sync, when they weren't even in the same time zone emotionally. Anne's own bedroom in Balmoral was situated near her father's. As a child, she remembered hearing late-night footsteps. Not pacing, not panicked, just heavy, deliberate movement, like a man wandering in search of somewhere he wasn't welcome. And Elizabeth's door? Always locked. One night, and allegedly heard a thud, a raised voice, and then silence. The next morning, breakfast was served as usual. But, and never forgot that sound. She never forgot the Queen's face at the table. Pale, tight-lipped, utterly still. Decades later, when asked by a biographer whether her parents had a romantic partnership, and offered a strange reply. They loved each other, certainly. But love isn't always soft. Sometimes it hardens into something. Practical. Practical. Is that how the Queen endured her marriage? As a performance? A shared duty to the nation, not to each other? Because here's what most people don't understand. Royal marriages aren't always about affection. They're about optics, stability, and lineage. But even in those terms, something still didn't add up. Why was there never a reconciliation? Never even a temporary return to shared quarters? Why, even into old age, did they live more like distant cousins than lifelong companions? And, by all accounts, respected her father. But she never adored him. Not the way Charles did. Not the way the media painted him. As a charming, misunderstood consort. Her views were shaped by what she saw, and what she heard. And by what her mother never said. Because the Queen didn't complain. She compartmentalized. She was the monarch of silence. But silence doesn't erase pain. It only buries it deeper. And, now in her 70s, is the last of her kind. Brutally honest, fiercely loyal, but not immune to bitterness. And in recent months, her tone toward her late father has shifted. Slightly. Sharply. One reporter recalled and saying, almost offhandedly, "There are things people choose not to know about him, for their own comfort." And then she added, "But Mother knew, and that's why she locked her door." So is it disgust? Betrayal? A revulsion born from something physical or emotional? Whatever it was, it split the royal marriage down the middle, and they covered it with velvet drapes, pageantry, and silence. But for Princess Anne, the illusion never worked, because she saw it crumble, one locked door at a time. And what she saw next, what she uncovered after the Queen's death, would take her understanding of her father to a whole new level. It wasn't just about where he slept. It was about what he brought with him when he knocked. And once she found the box in the Queen's sitting room, the mask came off. Because inside that box was a truth far worse than she expected. What if the man you admired from afar lived a life you couldn't stomach up close? For millions, Prince Philip was a war hero, a decorated naval officer, the Queen's steadfast consort. But to those who knew him intimately, truly, beyond the medals and microphones, he was something else. Complex, rebellious, and if Princess Anne is to be believed, deeply unsettling. Let's go back. Anne was barely 10 when she first realized her father had his own way of doing things. He'd vanish for hours, retreat to his study with items no one was allowed to touch. Boxes, books, scents. He'd slam the door if anyone knocked, even the Queen. Over time, Anne stopped asking questions. But the discomfort remained. Years later, she described her father's habits in unusually harsh terms for a royal, private, but not discreet. Obsessive, but not quiet about it. You always heard something odd. Odd. Let's talk about the rumors. Philip had interests, some benign, some bizarre. Obsessions with obscure Eastern rituals, unusual hygiene routines, strange lotions, oils, and salves he'd request be imported from obscure regions, Tunisia, Sri Lanka, Indonesia. One royal aide confessed, the packages always smelled fermented. You could smell them down the hallway. And the Queen? She hated it. She reportedly once asked the palace kitchen staff to stop preparing Philip's personal regimen of spices and tonics, citing the scent as unbearably cloying. One note from her hand, written in haste, found decades later, read simply, "I cannot breathe with him beside me." But this wasn't just about smells or preferences. This was about something deeper, and discovered, buried in the Queen's private drawer, a stack of handwritten notes detailing Philip's behaviors, coded, cautious, but clear. One note stood out. It read, "He brings it with him. Always. That smell. That obsession. I wake with it on my skin." Was it a lotion? A ritual? Or something darker? Some royal insiders point to his long-standing relationship with esoteric health gurus. One was reportedly banned from the palace after being caught preparing a paste with animal bone powder for the Duke's personal use. Another insisted Philip partake in detox rituals that involved steam chambers and substances the Queen found barbaric. And, hearing of these routines, began to piece together what her mother had endured. He was fixated on vitality, a valet revealed. Always drinking some brew, applying some new unguent. But he refused to shower after. That's right. The man who stood next to the Queen in pristine suits would sometimes go days without bathing, relying instead on his tonics and oils. Elizabeth, ever composed, kept her discomfort hidden in public. But in private, her frustration grew. Staff recalled her requesting her bedding be changed daily. Not because she was fussy, but because, as one housekeeper admitted, her room always reeked of what he left behind. And, growing up in that atmosphere, began to develop a visceral reaction to her father's tastes. She once said to a cousin, "He thought it made him virile. I thought it made him vile." And here's where the contradiction cuts deepest. Because Prince Philip, for all his eccentricities, was fiercely loyal to the monarchy. But loyalty doesn't always equal likability. He saw himself as a modern man, experimental, worldly, unafraid to try what others wouldn't. But in that pursuit, he crossed a line. Not legally, not scandalously, but intimately, repeatedly. Elizabeth bore it, until she didn't. Anne's discovery in that locked box included more than just letters. It included a dried vial, a label, faded, unreadable, and a photograph, Philip in his private study, shirtless, smeared in a dark paste from neck to waist. A post-it attached to the photo read, "The night I told him no more." And the date? Malta, 1957, the beginning of the end of their physical connection, and reportedly wept after finding it, not because it was grotesque, but because it finally confirmed what she had long suspected. Her mother hadn't simply chosen tradition. She had chosen self-preservation to survive a man who, over time, became something unrecognizable to the girl who first fell for him in her teenage years. But why hadn't the Queen ever told the public? Why had she protected Philip's image to the very end? Because image was everything. And admitting that your husband repulsed you would have shattered the monarchy's perfect illusion. But Anne, she has no such illusion to maintain. And once her mother passed, she began to speak. Carefully, quietly, but unmistakably. She never wanted to be near him at night, and reportedly told a journalist off record. Not after Malta. And when asked why, she whispered, because of what he brought to bed. The oils, the stench, the need. The need? That word lingered. What was Philip needing from those routines? From those rituals? Rejuvenation? Dominance? Escape? Or was it all just control? The truth remains murky. But the effect on the Queen, and on Anne, was crystal clear. It created distance, division, and ultimately, disgust. But here's where the story tilts again. Because while Anne was horrified, Charles worshipped his father, idolized him, defended him even now. And that rift would lead to the royal family's most awkward, painful silence yet. Because when Anne finally confronted Charles with what she'd found, his response left her speechless. And what came next would drive an even deeper wedge between the royal siblings, one from which they may never recover. What could have happened in paradise that sent a royal bride into silent retreat for the rest of her life? To the public, Malta was heaven, a sun-drenched haven away from the stiff corridors of Buckingham, a place where the newlywed Princess Elizabeth could live not as a monarch, but as a wife. Philip was stationed there with the Royal Navy, and for a brief window in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the couple tried to live a relatively normal life. But according to those who were closest to them, something happened in Malta that forever changed how Elizabeth saw her husband, and would only understand the gravity of that moment decades later, when she found the Queen's private Malta journal. It was hidden in a locked chest, tucked in a sealed cabinet in a lesser-used part of Windsor Castle. A thin, leather-bound book marked only with her mother's initials, R. The entries began innocently. Dinners with naval officers. Lazy afternoons by the Mediterranean. Elizabeth described Philip's laughter, his energy, his wit. She called him exhilarating. But then, the tone shifted. One entry read, "Philip came to bed late. I smelled it again, bitter, clinging. I asked him to leave. He laughed. I wept into my pillow until sunrise." That single entry broke something in Anne. She turned the page. The next note was shorter, sharper. He wore it like armor. I told him to sleep elsewhere. But what was it? And didn't have to guess. Tucked in the back of the journal was a letter folded 3 times. It was addressed to the Queen Mother. In it, Elizabeth detailed a disturbing night. He returned from Valletta with a new tonic. A man there, some healer, he says, prepared it for him. He smeared it on his chest, his arms, even his legs. He said it awakened him. I could not bear to touch him. The smell made me gag. I locked the door. This wasn't just about marriage. This was about invasion. The Queen, then only in her 20s, felt violated in her own room. The incident was never reported. No headlines. No public scandal. Just a royal couple returning from Malta with smiles, and a silent fracture that would never fully heal. And, upon reading the account, reportedly asked a royal archivist, "Why didn't anyone say something?" The response, "Because she was the Queen, and queens don't get to be disgusted. They endure." But Anne didn't accept that. She began to probe deeper. Spoke to surviving staffers. Dug through old trunks. Questioned the people who had served her mother in those early years. One former lady-in-waiting, now in her 90s, whispered a stunning admission. There was a smell on his clothing that made her physically ill. She would ask us to air out rooms for hours after he left. Another detail emerged. A footman recalled that after Malta, Elizabeth began sleeping with a lavender-scented cloth under her pillow. When asked why, she allegedly said, "Because I cannot have his scent near my dreams." These weren't minor grievances. These were survival tactics. and they marked a turning point in the royal marriage. From that moment on, Philip and Elizabeth rarely slept in the same room. And when asked years later why she'd made that decision, Elizabeth gave the standard line. It is the custom in aristocratic households. But and knew better, because the journal didn't end in Malta. It continued for years, sporadically, with coded language, but always returning to the same theme. The rituals, the tonics, the unwashed skin, the refusal to adapt, and the hurt. The queen, who ruled over nations, couldn't even convince her husband to bathe before bed. And worse, he didn't care. He'd joke with his friends about his potions, laugh about Elizabeth's weak stomach. According to one naval colleague, he even called her delicate for refusing his embrace, and never forgot that. And when she confronted Charles, years later, after the Queen's funeral, his reaction stunned her. He dismissed it, called it marital eccentricity, said that was their arrangement. It worked for them, but and snapped back. Did it work for her, or did she just survive it? Charles said nothing, and walked out, because in her mind, that incident in Malta wasn't just a quirk. It was the start of a pattern, a quiet suffering the Queen endured until her final breath. And it wasn't about potions. It was about being trapped beside someone who no longer saw your boundaries. A man the world saw as strong, but who made his own wife feel weak. And wasn't going to pretend anymore. Especially not after what she found next. Because hidden behind a sealed panel in the Queen's sitting room was a smaller box. And inside that box, a photo that would shake her to the core. Not of Malta, not of the palace, but of a private, shirtless Philip, smiling with pride. Covered in the same dark paste from neck to waist. The back of the photo was dated, and scribbled with one haunting line. He said it would make him invincible, and stared at the image for hours, then quietly slid it back into the box. Because if that was how Philip saw himself, she finally understood how her mother saw him too. Not as a partner, but as a man slowly transforming into someone she no longer recognized. And what would find next, buried beneath the Queen's sealed desk, would expose just how far that transformation had gone, and why the Queen never, ever, looked back. What kind of truth does a queen lock away in a silk-wrapped box? A truth so private, so painful, it couldn't be spoken, not to her children, not to her advisors, not even to her diary. After Elizabeth's death, the royal family combed through her private apartments to preserve heirlooms and memorabilia. But wasn't just there for nostalgia. She had questions. Questions that had haunted her since childhood. About Malta, about the smell, about the tears her mother tried to hide. And in the Queen's private sitting room at Windsor, hidden behind a portrait of Victoria and Albert, and found a narrow compartment. Inside, a box. Not ornate, not gilded, plain, wooden, and wrapped in a faded piece of blue silk embroidered with a single initial, E. It had no key, but didn't need one. She pried it open. What she found didn't scream scandal. It whispered tragedy. Inside were folded letters, a few aged photographs, and a smaller pouch, sealed with wax. The contents smelled faintly of lavender, as if someone had tried to mask something stronger, and unfolded the first letter. It was undated. No greeting, no signature, but unmistakably her mother's handwriting. I married a man who needed to conquer the world, and I became one of the things he conquered. And paused. She'd never heard her mother speak like this. Not with such vulnerability, such weariness. The next letter was even more unsettling. He used to come to me soaked in it. He said it made him alive, but I could only feel it burning. Not my skin, my peace. What was it? The box offered clues. One envelope contained receipts. Dozens. Some from foreign apothecaries. Others from private wellness consultants in countries like Morocco, Nepal, and India. Each had strange notations. Rejuvenation elixir, 5 vials. Blackroot paste, 3 jars. Stamina serum, not to be ingested by women. The Queen had kept them all, and written next to one invoice in her own hand. I begged him to stop. He smiled instead. The pouch? It held a cloth, brown-stained and stiff with time. Wrapped inside it was a small glass jar. Half full. The residue inside was thick, tar-like, and clung to the sides as Anne turned it in her hand. It reeked. Even sealed, the odor slipped through. Bitter. Medicinal. Rotten. Was this the substance the Queen wrote about? And dropped it. not out of shock, but revulsion. And that's when she found the photograph. A younger Philip, mid-1950s, bare-chested, kneeling on a mat. His torso gleamed with a dark film, slick and unnatural. In the background, a figure blurred by motion. A man, possibly foreign, holding a bowl. On the back of the photo, he said it was tradition. I called it trespass, and felt nauseous. Her father had practiced rituals, not just private ones, but secretive ones. Intimate routines the queen hadn't consented to, but endured, because he believed in them. And she believed in the monarchy. That was the real wound. Not that he changed, but that she couldn't stop him. She couldn't even speak of it. So she stored it all in a box, sealed in silk, surrounded by royal portraits and polite allusions, and sat alone for nearly an hour, rereading the letters, trying to make sense of it all. Not just the habits, the smells, or the foreign jars, but the woman behind them. Her mother, the stoic queen who smiled for millions, yet quietly flinched when the man she married entered her room, and had always suspected. But seeing the evidence, Elizabeth's words, her heartbreak preserved on paper, shattered her. One note stuck with her more than any other. It was scrawled, torn at the edges, barely legible. Tonight I saw him for what he is. Not a man, not a monster, something else, something unreachable. I locked the door. And then I locked myself. The handwriting trailed off, and tucked the letter back into the box. And then, something clicked. There was one more envelope, pressed flat against the lid. No name, just 3 words. Never forgive him. And froze. She didn't know when it was written, or what it specifically referred to, but it was the clearest indictment her mother had ever made. A quiet scream, folded and hidden away from the world. So what wouldn't do with it? Expose it? Burn it? Or keep it, like her mother did, and carry the weight silently? That decision would come later, because first, she had to confront the only other person who might have known something. Charles, the brother who still called Philip the greatest man he ever knew. And now had to ask herself, was he blind or complicit? The answer would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family. What happens when the quietest royal decides she's done protecting the past? For decades, princess and embodied royal restraint. No scandal, no emotional interviews, no reckless memoirs. If duty were a person, it wore a riding jacket and scowled just like her. But something changed after her mother's death. Not publicly, not immediately, but behind palace doors, and began to speak. And what she said sent tremors through the House of Windsor. It started with a closed-door conversation with Charles, just weeks after the Queen's funeral, and summoned him to her private residence at Gatcombe Park. No aides, no courtiers, just 2 siblings and a locked study. Inside, and placed the silk-wrapped box on the table between them. Charles, according to a senior source, refused to look inside, and didn't press. She didn't need to. Instead, she said just one sentence. You don't get to rewrite what she lived through. Charles replied carefully. She never complained. Anne's eyes, reportedly, were ice. That's because she knew it wouldn't matter. She then did something she'd never done before. She opened the box in front of him, pulled out a letter. Read it aloud. The one that ended with, I locked the door. And then I locked myself. Charles's hands were clenched, his face pale. But still, he defended Philip. He was flawed, but he was loyal. She chose him, and fired back. She chose survival. The argument escalated, not to shouting, but to something colder, sharper, and accused Charles of burying the truth for the sake of the crown, of painting Philip as a hero while ignoring the emotional toll he inflicted on their mother. Charles, for the first time in years, reportedly left without saying goodbye. That was the moment, and decided. She wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. But she didn't call a press conference. She called a journalist. Not just any journalist, but one who had once interviewed her mother. A veteran royal correspondent with a reputation for integrity and a locked vault of unpublished recordings, and requested a private meeting. The journalist, who is asked not to be named, later described Anne's demeanor as controlled rage wrapped in composure. She didn't hand over documents. She didn't even name specifics. But she did say this. There were things about Papa that people didn't want to see, because they preferred the myth to the man. The journalist asked if she meant affairs, and shook her head. Worse, it wasn't about who he touched. It was about what he carried with him, the things that clung to him, things Mother couldn't wash away. Chilling. The journalist asked if and had ever spoken to anyone else about it. She nodded. I tried. Once. To Mummy. And recounted a moment in her 20s, after walking in on her father during one of his rituals. She said the scent nearly knocked her out. And the sight of him, covered in slick, dark substances, chanting under his breath, left her shaken. When she told the Queen, Elizabeth simply said, "He believes it keeps him strong. Let him have that," and never brought it up again. Until now. Because with both her parents gone, the burden of silence no longer served any purpose. And when the journalist asked the final, daring question, "Would you ever speak publicly?" and gave a cryptic answer, "Not while certain people are alive. But I've made preparations." Preparations? The journalist pressed for clarity and refused, but then offered this chilling line. If people knew what she endured quietly, they'd stop romanticizing what he represented. Not long after that meeting, whispers began to circulate about an unpublished memoir, about recordings left in a solicitor's care, about a sealed testimony that could only be opened under certain conditions. And then came the phone call. The journalist, now back in London, received a voicemail from a blocked number. A female voice, distorted. Tell her to stop. Some truths stay buried for a reason. And was notified. And her response? She laughed. Not with joy, with defiance. They still think they can protect him. Even now. Even from beyond the grave. And had made up her mind. She wouldn't do a Netflix series. She wouldn't write a scandal book. But she would make sure her mother's private pain didn't disappear. And as she stood in the Queen's old private quarters one last time, her eyes settled on a portrait of Philip and Elizabeth, smiling, youthful, idealized, and looked at it and whispered, she deserved better. But what and didn't know yet was that someone else had been keeping tabs. And one of the Queen's former aides? He had a secret of his own, one that would crack this story wide open. How many secrets can a single room hold? More than and ever imagined. In the days following the Queen's funeral, senior royals were allowed to visit the late monarch's private chambers one last time, before everything was catalogued, archived, and sealed by the Crown's legal team. And had a specific request, to be left alone in her mother's favorite room, her personal sitting closet. Not the one tourists see in documentaries. This one was off limits. Known only to family and a handful of trusted aides, it was a quiet, windowless annex attached to the Queen's bedroom suite at Windsor Castle. Elizabeth used it not for dressing, but for remembering. A sanctuary of photos, handwritten notes, and drawers full of memories. Not the kind that get displayed in glass cases, but the kind you bury when you're trying to protect a legacy. And tucked into the farthest corner of that closet was a piece of furniture and had never seen before. A slim, antique writing desk. French. Dusty. Its lower drawer jammed tight. And pulled. Nothing. She searched until she found a small brass key, taped to the bottom of the desk itself. Unlabeled. Forgotten. With a soft click, the drawer slid open. Inside, dozens of papers. Most of them official correspondences, typed and marked private. Some were notes between Elizabeth and palace doctors. But one stack, bound with a red ribbon, was labeled in the Queen's own hand. PM, private memoranda. Anne's breath caught. She knew that signature. She recognized the script. But the contents? Devastating. Each memorandum was a dated summary, written by the Queen herself, documenting her private observations of Philip's behavior. Some notes were clinical. Others read like diary entries. But the tone grew increasingly strained over time. One entry read, "He insists on sleeping with the windows shut and his oils burning. I wake choking, always coughing. He says I am weak. Perhaps I am. I cannot sleep beside him anymore." Another, "He brought a new paste this evening. Said it came from Tibet. The smell made me ill. I asked him to bathe. He laughed. I asked again. He raised his voice." And kept reading, heart pounding. "The staff tries not to notice, but I see it on their faces. They know. They pretend not to. As I do." One particularly painful note was dated just after the Queen's Silver Jubilee. "He arrived at my chambers with a new vial. Rubbed it on his hands, his chest, his temples. When I declined his touch, he accused me of withholding affection. I said nothing. What could I say? I no longer recognized the man I married." Anne's hands trembled. Her mother, Queen of the United Kingdom, defender of the faith, had documented her slow emotional withdrawal in heartbreaking detail. And then came the line that stopped in cold. And nose. Dated 1987. No context. No explanation. Just those two words. And closed her eyes. That was the year she'd walked into Philip's study unannounced and caught him shirtless. Again, covered in that awful gray-black mixture. He had turned, startled, then barked, "Get out." She never told anyone. But her mother had known. The phrase, "and nose," wasn't an observation. It was a warning. A passing of silent, generational trauma. And suddenly, Anne understood something deeper. This wasn't just about aversion. This wasn't just about a smell, or a ritual, or even emotional distance. It was about erasure. The queen had buried her suffering beneath protocol, beneath loyalty, beneath motherhood, and sealed it all in desk drawers and ribbon stacks. Because she couldn't risk the world knowing she had been repulsed by the man standing beside her on every balcony. And Anne, she had inherited that silence. Until now, as she folded the memoranda back into the drawer, she noticed something else, taped to the bottom of the top panel. A small envelope. Plain. Cream-colored. No seal. Inside was a handwritten card. Short. Sharply penned. "Do not let them make him a saint." No signature. No date. But Anne recognized her mother's calligraphy immediately. The weight of that sentence knocked the breath out of her. Elizabeth didn't hate Philip, but she could not allow history to erase the reality of what she had endured. And in passing that envelope to Anne, she ensured that, one day, the truth would surface, and tucked it into her coat. And as she stood to leave, she whispered into the stillness of the room, "I won't let them." But as she stepped into the hallway, she saw someone unexpected. An elderly man, stooped, gray-bearded, one of her mother's longest-serving aides. He held something in his hand, a letter, and what he said next would rewrite everything Anne thought she knew about her mother's final years. What kind of disgust leaves a queen speechless for decades? Not the theatrical kind, not public outrage, not scandal splashed across tabloids. This was quieter, thicker, the kind that settled into the bones and made even the most powerful woman in the world recoil behind locked doors. And Princess Anne had just found someone who'd seen it firsthand. The man in the hallway, Mr. Geoffrey Brandt, had served the Queen as her senior night steward for nearly 30 years. Retired now, he'd returned to Windsor at the invitation of the estate manager to assist with archival sorting. But when he saw Anne leaving her mother's private room, his expression changed. It wasn't grief. It was burden. He held a letter in his gloved hand, creased, yellowed with time. Wordlessly, he offered it to her, and opened it carefully. There were only 3 sentences, typed on royal stationery. "Mr. Brandt, please make sure the oils are removed from my chamber before morning. I do not want to wake to that smell again. Kindly instruct staff not to place His Royal Highness's belongings near my quarters." It was signed Elizabeth R. Geoffrey cleared his throat. That was the 3rd one she sent, all regarding the same issue. "I kept this one. I shouldn't have, but I feared it would be erased like the others." And stared at him, her jaw tight. "What did you see?" He hesitated, then gave a quiet nod. Permission, perhaps, to finally speak. "Ma'am, I was on the night shift for 15 years. I saw your father's routines. The ointments, the imported jars. I heard the Queen's orders. Burn the sheets, remove the residue, scrub the headboard." She was always polite, but always specific. She did not want a trace of him near her bed. Burn the sheets? This wasn't a woman slightly annoyed by an eccentric husband. This was a woman actively scrubbing him from her environment. Geoffrey continued. "She once told me, in passing, I cannot share my sleep with that smell. It gets into the dreams." That line hit, and like a slap. She had heard that exact phrasing once, in childhood. Thought it was metaphor. It wasn't. And asked Geoffrey if her mother ever complained, truly complained. He shook his head. Never with fury. Only fatigue. But sometimes, revulsion. Once, she looked me in the eye and said, "He thinks it's spiritual. I think it's decay." And didn't respond. She couldn't, because it all matched. The letters, the journals, the memoranda, the silence, all circling one truth. Elizabeth had been repulsed, not by who Philip was, but by what he became. And nobody had dared name it. Because how do you accuse the Queen's husband of making her physically ill without saying a single word? You don't. You bury it. You label it tradition. You normalize the separate bedrooms. You cast the Queen's reserved demeanor as duty, when in fact it was protection. Geoffrey then said something even darker. The staff kept count, of how often we were asked to fumigate, change linen, cleanse rooms after he'd visit her side of the castle. It grew over the years. By the end, she wouldn't even let his jackets hang near her wardrobe, and asked, "Did anyone question it?" He gave a bitter smile. "We're not trained to question. We're trained to obey." But we knew, ma'am. We knew she dreaded the nights when he insisted on closeness, and she celebrated the weeks he was away, and had heard enough. She turned to leave, but Geoffrey called out softly, "There's one more thing, ma'am." He reached into his coat and handed her a small card. It was unsigned, just a quote, written in the Queen's unmistakable handwriting. "One can endure anything, except the stench of betrayal cloaked as ritual." And didn't speak. She didn't have to, because that card said everything. It wasn't about potions, or tonics, or Philip's obsessions with unorthodox health practices. It was about consent, about discomfort, about crossing lines no one could see, but the Queen felt every night, and realized something even more painful in that moment. Her mother had spent a lifetime portraying serenity, diplomacy, grace, but every evening, behind closed doors, she was fighting off a man who believed his practices were invincible, who refused to change, who demanded space, and then invaded hers. And nobody called it what it was, because calling it what it was meant acknowledging that even the Queen of England had no escape from the private revolutions within her own marriage, and clutched the note to her chest. She understood now. The disgust wasn't just physical. It was existential, and it was hers to name now, because the Queen never had the freedom to. But the question still lingered. Why? Why had Elizabeth protected Philip's image so fiercely? What was she afraid of? And as prepared to walk away from the only aide brave enough to speak, Geoffrey said something that stopped her in her tracks. "There's a letter, ma'am. One more. From the Queen to you. She wrote it just before she passed. But it never left the vault." And turned slowly. "What vault?" And Geoffrey, barely audible, said, "The one Charles sealed. How do you spend 73 years married to someone, yet live as if you're worlds apart?" For decades, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were hailed as the ultimate partnership, a model of royal unity. Publicly, they were the perfect pair, moving in step, waving in sync, photographed like clockwork. But knew the choreography was just that, an illusion. Because behind palace walls, the Queen and her consort were more like well-dressed strangers than soulmates. Two sovereign shadows crossing paths, but rarely touching. And the evidence was everywhere. Separate bedrooms in every royal residence. Separate dressing quarters. Separate travel itineraries. Even their mealtimes diverged, often eating apart, served by different staff on different china sets. And saw it all. As a child, she used to wonder if this was normal. She asked once, innocently, why Mummy and Papa never sit together after supper. The Queen, without looking up from her embroidery, replied, "Some people grow more distant to keep the peace." And didn't understand it then. But she understood it now. It wasn't just physical distance. It was emotional insulation. The Queen, who dined with presidents and prime ministers, couldn't even share a sofa with her husband without bracing herself. And Philip? He seemed oblivious. Or worse, proud. "We're not like civilians," he once joked to a guest at Balmoral. "We give each other breathing room. Or in my case, snoring room." Laughter followed. But didn't laugh. Because she remembered the Queen's look whenever Philip made those offhand comments. Tight-lipped. Hollow. Embarrassed. By the 1980s, Elizabeth and Philip's separate lives were so routine that palace staff had them down to a science. They'd make sure their paths didn't cross in corridors unless scheduled. Their private secretaries communicated more than they did. Even their holidays were split. Elizabeth preferred Balmoral. Philip took to Sandringham. Or, more often, solo retreats to remote estates where he could indulge in his practices without interference. And once overheard her mother tell a lady-in-waiting, "He can do what he likes, so long as he doesn't bring the jars home." But he always did, and the Queen always recoiled. There was one particularly painful moment that, never forgot. She was in her 30s, visiting Windsor. A storm had knocked out part of the estate's power, and without warning, Philip arrived at the Queen's quarters, shirt damp, arms glistening with that same bitter-smelling tonic, and walked in seconds after him. The queen, pale and rigid, stood against the wall, hands clenched, breath shallow. Philip, irritated, muttered something about not being welcome in his own castle, then stormed out, and turned to her mother, who said nothing. She just sank slowly into her chair, then whispered, "I dread the evenings," and couldn't unhear it. From that moment, she stopped pretending. Her father was no monster, but he was no myth either. He was a man so consumed by his own rituals, his own sense of superiority, that he failed to see the slow erosion he left in his wake. And Anne, she bore witness to all of it. The empty seats, the changed sheets, the way her mother would physically lean away during joint interviews, gently, discreetly, but always. Still, the public kept asking, how did they make it work? And the palace, year after year, trotted out the same line, a shared sense of duty, a united front. But behind that front was a woman retreating further into herself, and recalled how the queen's bedtime routine evolved, from a glass of water and a prayer to earplugs, lavender oils, and a triple-locked door. And when asked by a close confidant why she went to such lengths, Elizabeth reportedly replied, "Because peace of mind is not guaranteed, especially not in your own bed." The queen had built a fortress within a fortress, and Philip, intentionally or not, had been exiled from it, and had asked herself countless times, was it emotional neglect? Was it something darker? But the answer, she realized, was simpler. It was disgust. Slow, accumulated, muted by years of endurance, but always present. And perhaps most haunting, it had started with love. Real love. In their early years, Elizabeth had adored Philip, his strength, his sense of adventure, his gallows humor. She wrote letters to friends gushing about his smile, his letters, his confidence. But over time, that confidence hardened into arrogance. His eccentricities deepened into compulsions. And the man she married, her partner, her support, became a source of dread. And once told a palisade, she didn't stop loving him. She just stopped letting him in. But that emotional exile wasn't without consequence. Because while the queen quietly built her distance, Philip found comfort in solitude, or in something else. Something Anne was about to uncover. Because buried among her mother's documents, Anne would find a sealed report, one marked for Her Majesty's eyes only. It was written by palace medical staff, and inside, it detailed something about Philip's physical state that shocked even Anne. Something that might explain the lotions, the pastes, the rituals, but also something that might explain why Elizabeth stopped touching him at all. What Anne found in that file would rewrite the narrative once more. And this time, it wasn't just emotional. It was medical, and it was irreversible. At what point does protecting the family name become protecting a lie? Princess Anne had always been known as the most loyal royal, the one who never complained, never explained, the one who rode horses at sunrise and rarely smiled for the cameras. She was her father's daughter, stoic, sharp, and unshakable. Until now. Because after reading her mother's private documents, smelling those jars with her own hands, and hearing the late-night recollections of former staff, something in and snapped. Not into hysteria, but into clarity. She wasn't going to keep the silence anymore. Not for the monarchy, not for appearances, and especially not for her brother. Because when she confronted Charles, again, with the sealed medical file she found among the Queen's effects, his reaction confirmed her deepest suspicion. He already knew. The file, dated from the early 2000s, was authored by two palace physicians. Its contents were clinical but damning. Prince Philip had developed a rare glandular disorder that affected his sweat glands, skin chemistry, and body odor. The condition, while not dangerous to his health, produced a pungent, chemical-like smell intensified by certain herbal treatments he refused to stop using. One doctor described it as a sour, mineral-heavy musk that is aggravated by his tonic regimen and avoidance of conventional hygiene practices. Another line chilled and to the bone. Her Majesty has expressed physical aversion to prolonged proximity due to the sensory triggers associated with the Duke's condition. It is advised that contact be limited when possible. In other words, Philip's body had become a sensory assault on the Queen. And instead of stopping his rituals, he doubled down and brought the report to Charles. He skimmed it without surprise, then calmly folded it back and said, Yes. I read it years ago and stared at him. You knew? And said nothing? Charles placed the report aside. He was our father, and she made her peace with it. You should too. Anne's jaw clenched. She didn't make peace. She locked doors, changed sheets, burned clothing. Charles didn't flinch. She kept the institution afloat. That was her peace. And stood up. You mean she suffered? Silently. And you helped keep it buried. Charles's voice dropped an octave. I protected the monarchy. Like she did. Like you should. Anne's voice cracked. She didn't need protection. She needed someone to see what she was enduring. A long silence followed. And then Charles said something that made Anne's skin crawl. She endured. Because that was her duty. Not to herself. To the crown. That was the moment Anne stopped seeing her brother as her ally and started seeing him as part of the machine. Because to Charles, everything was transactional. If Elizabeth had to suffer in private so the world could keep believing in the fairy tale, then that was a fair exchange. And disagreed. Vehemently. She was our mother. Not a brand. Charles didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence said it all. So Anne walked away. Back to her estate. Back to the Queen's notes. Back to the faint lavender scent still lingering on those letters. And she made a decision. If the men in her family were going to protect Philip Smith, she was going to protect her mother's truth. She contacted the Queen's former solicitor and made a quiet request to review any sealed documents, bequeathed recordings, or written wishes left behind, particularly those involving Anne. It took weeks, but eventually, she received a response. There was a vault, and inside, a final letter from the Queen, not addressed to the nation, not even to the family, but just to Anne, sealed, unopened, untouched since Elizabeth's passing, and stared at the envelope for hours before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakable. The contents? More honest than anything the Queen had ever said aloud. My dearest Anne, you always saw what others chose not to. I never said thank you. For your silence. For your knowing. For never asking. There are things a woman cannot say, even to her daughter. Especially to her daughter. But you understood. You saw the oils. You smelled the sheets. You knew why I closed my door. I was not cruel. I was preserving myself. You are the only one I trust to carry this truth. I don't ask you to expose it, only to hold it. And if one day, the story must be told, tell it as it was, not as it looked. With love always. Mummy. And folded the letter slowly. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Because this wasn't grief. It was rage. Quiet. Controlled. But burning like acid under her skin. All her life. And had played the loyal soldier. But now? Now she was holding the Queen's final confession. The truth no one wanted. The truth no one else was trusted with. And she was done being quiet. Because the next time the world asked her about Prince Philip, she wouldn't lie. And when the palace heard that, they panicked. Because what Anne did next would risk shattering the myth for good. What happens when a future king demands silence, and his sister refuses? The royal family thrives on unity. Smiling faces. Shared gestures. Controlled messaging. But behind the castle gates, the rift between Charles and Anne had never been wider. And now, after Elizabeth's death and the revelations locked away in her private quarters, it had become unbridgeable. Because while Charles mourned Philip as a hero and had uncovered the man Elizabeth could barely share a room with, the tipping point came quietly. No press release. No explosive headlines. Just a tense exchange between a monarch and his sister inside Clarence's house, away from cameras, but witnessed by more than one aide. Charles had summoned Anne. His tone, icy, formal, a far cry from the soft nostalgia he'd been peddling to the public. The topic? Her conversations with the journalist. The whispers of a sealed letter. The rumors about what she had found in their mother's personal effects. You're creating noise, he said, standing behind his desk, hands clasped. And, seated, replied without blinking. I'm telling the truth. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You're destabilizing what she spent her entire life protecting. And stood. She protected the monarchy. But no one protected her. The room fell into silence. Charles exhaled slowly. She never wanted it aired. That's why she buried it. Anne's reply was colder than the stone walls around them. She buried it because you, and the men around her, never gave her permission to feel repulsed. Charles, for a moment, dropped the act. She was queen. She didn't need permission. She needed discipline. and blinked. Discipline? You think it was discipline that kept her from screaming? From walking out? From locking her door every night for 40 years? He leaned in. It kept the institution intact. That's all that matters. There it was. The quiet confession of a man raised in palaces, fed on protocol, and trained to believe image was worth more than reality. But and had broken through. Because she wasn't speaking as a royal. She was speaking as a daughter. A daughter who'd read her mother's final words. Held the ashes of her heartbreak in her hands. Smelled the bitter rot of a man's obsession still clinging to her old linens. And walked to the door. Charles called after her. If you speak publicly, you will divide this family. She paused. No, the division already happened. You just chose to ignore it. And she left. But Charles wasn't finished. Within 48 hours, palace aides were instructed to initiate a containment protocol. The order? Prevent any documents from the Queen's private archive from being reviewed without explicit royal authorization. One of the aides described it bluntly. He's sealing the vault. And was livid. She fired back. Not through the media, but through her own legal team. She requested formal access to the documents she had already viewed, citing her role as executor of several of the Queen's personal estates. Charles blocked it. He cited national interest and historical sanctity, and saw it for what it was, fear. Because for all of Charles's flowery tributes to their father, deep down, he knew. He knew what Philip had become. He knew about the tonics, the sheets, the letters, the rituals. And he knew how much the Queen suffered. But Charles had one goal: preserve the narrative. Philip the war hero, the modernizer, the steadfast partner, and anything that contradicted that was to be destroyed or denied. Anne's response: she made copies of everything. The Queen's handwritten letters, the sealed note with "Never forgive him," the medical file, the lavender cloths. She placed them in a private vault under her own legal protection. And then she made one final move that sent shockwaves through palace corridors. She drafted a personal statement, and signed, undated and not yet public, but real. In it, she wrote, "History is not protected by silence. It is preserved by truth. My mother was revered as a sovereign, but she was silenced as a woman. I will not let her voice die with her." That was the moment the courtiers knew, and wasn't bluffing, and the institution was rattled. Behind the scenes, a smear campaign began. Sources close to the palace started quietly briefing select reporters that Anne was grieving in her own way and processing her mother's death through personal interpretations. Translation: she was making it up, but Anne didn't flinch. She'd heard worse, and now she was playing the long game. Because this wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration, about honoring the woman behind the crown, the one who endured without complaint. The one who held a nation together while holding her breath at night, because her own husband brought rituals and substances that made her skin crawl. But the next step in Anne's plan wouldn't come from her. It would come from the one royal aide who didn't stay silent. The man who had spent the most nights outside the Queen's bedroom door. And who, years ago, had quietly started recording everything he saw. What he captured would make everything and said impossible to ignore. What could have happened in paradise that sent a royal bride into silent retreat for the rest of her life? To the public, Malta was heaven, a sun-drenched haven away from the stiff corridors of Buckingham, a place where the newlywed Princess Elizabeth could live not as a monarch, but as a wife. Philip was stationed there with the Royal Navy, and for a brief window in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the couple tried to live a relatively normal life. But according to those who were closest to them, something happened in Malta that forever changed how Elizabeth saw her husband, and would only understand the gravity of that moment decades later, when she found the Queen's private Malta journal. It was hidden in a locked chest, tucked in a sealed cabinet in a lesser-used part of Windsor Castle. A thin, leather-bound book marked only with her mother's initials, R. The entries began innocently: dinners with naval officers, lazy afternoons by the Mediterranean. Elizabeth described Philip's laughter, his energy, his wit. She called him exhilarating. But then, the tone shifted. One entry read, "Philip came to bed late. I smelled it again, bitter, clinging. I asked him to leave. He laughed. I wept into my pillow until sunrise." That single entry broke something in Anne. She turned the page. The next note was shorter, sharper. "He wore it like armor. I told him to sleep elsewhere. But what was it? And didn't have to guess. Tucked in the back of the journal was a letter folded 3 times. It was addressed to the Queen Mother. In it, Elizabeth detailed a disturbing night. He returned from Valletta with a new tonic. A man there, some healer, he says, prepared it for him. He smeared it on his chest, his arms, even his legs. He said it awakened him. I could not bear to touch him. The smell made me gag. I locked the door. This wasn't just about marriage. This was about invasion. The Queen, then only in her 20s, felt violated in her own room. The incident was never reported. No headlines. No public scandal. Just a royal couple returning from Malta with smiles and a silent fracture that would never fully heal. And, upon reading the account, reportedly asked a royal archivist, "Why didn't anyone say something?" The response, "Because she was the queen, and queens don't get to be disgusted. They endure." And didn't accept that. She began to probe deeper. Spoke to surviving staffers. Dug through old trunks. Questioned the people who had served her mother in those early years. One former lady-in-waiting, now in her 90s, whispered a stunning admission. There was a smell on his clothing that made her physically ill. She would ask us to air out rooms for hours after he left. Another detail emerged. A footman recalled that after Malta, Elizabeth began sleeping with